Hello and welcome to It Matters How We Treat One Another, the social psychology show. I'm your host, Matthew David Vasco. If you've subscribed to this show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, then thank you. This is a new show and we are grateful for each and every one of our subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please consider doing so. This is the final episode of Season 1 of It Matters How We Treat One Another. Season 2 will start in the fall. Please subscribe to receive notice when the first episode of the new season gets released. The finale today features an interview with Dr. Michael Kocet on the topic of helping our friends and loved ones navigate grief. We open today with our Inspiring News segment. If inspiring things are happening in your neck of the woods, then please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. That's M as in Matthew, D as in David, VASKO @gmail.com and let me know. This week's Inspiring News comes from Good News Network. The headline reads, in part, couple in their 80s have fostered more than 150 children. The article goes on to say, English couple Margaret Isdale and her husband Robert decided to welcome a teenage girl into their home for foster care back in 1978. Now, over 40 years later, they are receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award because the octogenarians have fostered an incredible 150 children and teenagers. From the town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, England, they received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Lincolnshire Foster Services, whose administrator, Michelle Sauminidin, was in awe of the pair, saying that over their 46 years of raising other people's children, lots of them have either gone back to their birth families or gone on to be adopted. This is a truly inspiring story. The world needs more caring foster parents. If you want to learn more about becoming a foster parent, contact your local Department of Children and Family Services. They are always looking for caring people to be foster parents. Again, if you know of inspiring news happening in your area, please email me at mdvasco@gmail.com. Thanks. Before I move on to the interview, I do want to give a quick trigger warning. In this interview, we will discuss difficult forms of loss. We will go in depth on grief, and there will be some discussion of loss due to suicide and possible causes of suicide. So please be aware of that. And now, on to our feature segment. My guest today is Dr. Michael Kocet. He is a licensed mental health counselor who has been a grief counselor for over 25 years and has taught a graduate course in grief and loss for over 22 years. He is a university administrator and professor of counseling at the University of Colorado, Denver. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And I suppose I should add, just for the sake of transparency, that you and I are old buddies. That
we shouldn't say how long we've known each other. That's a good way.
We don't, yeah, that's true. We don't want to cop to our ages, do we? But a while.
Through theater.
Yeah, through theater in college. So the good old days.
Yes.
So, well, welcome, Michael. It's a real treat to get to talk with you about what has been your professional life now for the last many years. And I thought I would just dive right into it. My first question is, what's the first thing you would say to someone who asked you, how can I help a friend or loved one cope with grief?
I think that's really a critical question. I think the the big thing is, when we have a family member, a friend, or a coworker who's going through a loss, sometimes we want to take away their pain. And I would just say, the best thing that we can do is just to like sit and be there with people in their grief, not to try to minimize it or take it away or, kind of like help them forget about it. It's just about being present, with a grieving family member or friend. Um, Sometimes people may not even realize that they're grieving because a lot of times people think that grief is only related to death related losses. But in my work, I focus a lot on non-death losses, whether it's divorce or ending of a friendship of 20 years. It could be moving. Even happy events can bring around grief and loss. So, for example, a couple who are getting married, it's certainly a joyful celebration, but it's a loss of independence. So it's in some ways, it's a loss of um, I can do whatever I want. Now I have this person who's like, where are you going? When are you coming home?
Right.
Even having a baby, again, a joyful event, but the fact that now maybe that couple or that person who's becoming a parent, they're not as independent. They can't just spontaneously go on a vacation. Now they've got this child that they got to take care of for the next 18, 35 years, whatever. So yeah, so even happy events can bring out elements of grief and loss. So I think it's just about being present and supportive, and not trying to fix it or make it go away.
That's so true. I think I can think of, times in my own life where I realized, oh my gosh, I'm grieving. One was I live in Los Angeles, and people tend to come out here and try something new, and then maybe make the decision to move back where they came from, and I just had over the years really good friends move away, and that's tough. And it took me a while to go, oh my gosh, I am like grieving a loss here. This is a
Absolutely.
big change. I'm not loving it.
And even if in that case of your friends who moved away, it doesn't mean that you're not still in touch with them, but it's different. Like so for example, I just moved to Denver, Colorado about, a year and about 4 or 5 months ago. And I miss, I came from Chicago, where I was for 7.5 years. I miss my friends. But even things like I miss my dry cleaner, Sunny, this woman, she was my dry cleaner for all the time I lived in my little neighborhood in Rogers Park, Chicago. And I found another dry cleaner here, but it's just not the same. You know,
Hmm.
Sunny and I had a friendly relationship, and when her dad died, I sent her flowers, and she was very supportive when my mom died. So those relationships mean a lot. And
Yeah.
it can be a favorite restaurant that like so for example during COVID, I mean it certainly there was a lot of grief in many different ways, but even like a favorite restaurant in the neighborhood closed down for good because of COVID. That can be a grief, grieving that, the sense of community, the sense of family, the sense of familiarity, things like that. So I say as a therapist and counselor that um regardless of why somebody comes to therapy or counseling, I think the core issue is some form of grief and loss, whether the person recognizes it or not.
So loss really is the appropriate word then, as opposed to say a death or a passing, right? Because there are many different forms of loss.
Absolutely. And I always tell people there's two forms of grief. We can grieve over, maybe a loved one, memories, things that we did with that person, what we miss about their personality and who they were. But we can also grieve over what we never got. So,
Hmm.
for example, you could have somebody whose father died, and maybe they were just a bastard. They were abusive. They were just a not good person.
Hmm.
And that child, that adult child, can still grieve over the loss of their parent because maybe they're grieving over that they never had a close relationship with their dad or their mom or whomever. So, we can grieve over what we never got to.
That's true. That's true. I definitely see your perspective on that. Something I've heard over the years is that people sometimes feel like others in their lives want them to sort of hurry up and get over it. They'll say that to me. I just feel like everybody wants me to get over it already, and I'm not ready to be over it. I need more time.
Yeah.
What can we do to support someone without making them feel like we're rushing them through grief?
Well, I think not asking that question, like, aren't you over it yet? Or it's been 6 months or it's been a year. So if somebody, like, so for example, if somebody got a divorce or ending of a romantic relationship or partnership, people say, well, there's other fish in the sea. Like that's not helpful to say that. Um, to somebody, they may be grieving. Now, maybe they know that that divorce was necessary or healthy or right for them, but there can still be grief and loss, sadness over, a marriage or a relationship. And even in a case where there's, abuse in a relationship or something, but there are still redeeming qualities about the person who was abusive, what attracted them to begin with, that they may be grieving. So, like, and for example, I always say that each loss is unique and individual to each person. So, uh, it's important as friends and family of other people not to minimize a loss, or compare our losses to somebody else, saying, "Oh, well, my loss is nothing compared to that loss."
Hmm.
Uh, so for example, if we have like, a 15 or 16-year-old, child or adolescent in our life, and maybe they've gone through a breakup and they're devastated. And, as adults, we may say, "Oh, honey, you're gonna meet lots of people. Like you'll get over this, whatever." Well, we can say that maybe as an adult who's maybe been through different relationships, but to that 15 or 16-year-old, this is an overwhelming loss. So, um, it's about what it represents. So again, trying to make it light of it and be like, "Oh, well, you're going to meet other people," or, there's also something called disenfranchised losses. And Dr. Ken Doka, who's a grief expert, coined that term, disenfranchised loss. And the way I define those kind of losses are the kind of losses that we can't give a Hallmark card to.
Hmm.
So, for example, grieving an ex-spouse or an ex-partner who's died. Like, there's no cards that say, "My condolences at the loss of your ex-wife or your ex-husband,"
Yeah.
but you're still grieving, but you can grieve it publicly. I've had people in my life whose ex-partners died and I said, "Well, aren't you happy that they're gone?" And like, no, like,
Hmm.
they're the father or the mother of my child or whatever it
Right.
is. So like, there's no space for that. I had a friend recently whose dad died, and her parents were divorced, but her mom went to the funeral. And I think that's very healthy
Yeah.
to be able to go and do that and express that. Because just because somebody was separated or divorced doesn't mean that they still don't have care, love, and affection in some way for that person, even if the divorce was necessary, or for ending of friendships. I mentioned that earlier. That's a form of disenfranchised loss. There's no Hallmark card that says, "My condolences at the end of your 20-year friendship." But I mean, as a therapist, I've talked with people who, like, "I don't know what happened. She just stopped talking to me. She won't text me back. No one will tell me what's going on. Our mutual friends, they know something, but nobody will tell me anything." And so I miss our friendship. So there can be a lot of different types of losses that people carry in their hearts that just go unattended, and that
Right.
can contribute to anxiety, depression, other types of things. And again, people may not even realize that they're grieving because it's not a death.
Sort of as a follow-up question to that, um, I've found in my own experience trying to help someone who's coping with loss, um, that sometimes it seems like it may be one place in life where empathy sort of fails us a little bit, where we want to try to relate to the person, but it seems like inevitably when you say, "Oh, I know how you feel because I lost my grandfather so many years ago," they inevitably want to tell you how their loss is different than that. But you don't understand. This is different because of X, Y, and Z. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, yes. So I think it's important that we, again, not like try to show up somebody like, oh, well, I've had that loss too, or I had a friend who, my mom died just a month after I moved to Denver, Colorado. So I didn't have any friends here really to support me, and it was really a tough time. And I had a friend who was like, Michael, I'm surprised that you're still grieving so much over your mom's death because she was sick for a long time, like it was anticipated. And then the person started talking about, well, that they had more losses than me.
Mm,
And I was just incredibly hurt. I mean, this is a friend that I've had for 30 years, somebody I care about deeply. And I know that they were not, they didn't intend to be hurtful, but it was incredibly hurtful. Um, and I needed some time away. Like, we didn't talk for a little bit. And then eventually I just said, like what you said that day really affected me. Like it really hurt me because it was like comparing, like your losses were greater. And so, we can't assume that just because somebody, for example, if we have a friend whose, dad died and our dad died, that we know exactly what was going on because every relationship is different. So maybe we had a very strong relationship with our father, but our friend who just lost their dad, maybe it was a strained relationship and there's grief around that. So, I think that we can be aware of our own losses and what we've experienced, but also be mindful that no two losses are alike.
mhm,
Um, Grief, I always liken grief to like a snowflake. People, no two snowflakes are alike, and no two people grieve the same way. And sometimes there can be family conflict around the fact that maybe our siblings or our parents or other people around us are grieving in a way that we don't think they should. Like, maybe somebody is more reserved in their grief. They're not crying. And it's like, well, why are you so cold-hearted? Like, you haven't even shed a tear over mom's death. Like, what's the matter with you?
mhm,
Or on the reverse, like, will you stop crying already? Get over it. Like, yeah, mom was older. Like, she lived a full life. Like, quit crying.
mhm,
And so those kind of things aren't helpful. So we have to understand that everybody grieves, differently and just to be respectful. So one of the things I tell people, and I tell my students in my grief class, two questions to ask any grieving person that I think are helpful. The first is, what do you need right now? And sometimes that can be a very practical thing. So let's just say that, you have a neighbor and their partner died. So now all of a sudden they're a single parent, they've got little kids running a household, they're overwhelmed. And maybe they say, I just need help folding laundry, or I just don't have the energy to cut the grass, or I could really use somebody to go to the store and get some dinner for me and the kids, because I just getting in the car and driving somewhere is just exhausting, right now. So it's the practical way, practical things that we can do for neighbors to help out. And then the second question that I encourage people to say is, what don't you need right now? So
mhm,
maybe a grieving person is like, if one more person asks me how I'm doing, my head's gonna explode. Like I wish people would stop asking me if I'm okay,
yeah.
or whatever, so I just did a workshop on grieving in the workplace. And one of the things we talk about is generally workplaces are not very grief friendly.
Mhm,
Once people are going back to work, they're expected to perform and do their jobs the same way, and even in my own life, after my mom's death and I returned to work, and I'm a grief counselor, but it was hard. Sometimes I just had to close my office door, and I was in a very supportive environment. My boss was like, if you just need to leave, or if you need to work from home or take a day off, whatever, it's fine. And sometimes I did. But not everybody has that privilege. If somebody works in a situation where they're on the clock and, they can't call in sick because then they're not going to have income. Um, so those are very real issues. So some people have to still force themselves to go to work and get out of bed or go to school or do whatever, even though their heart is really heavy and they're grieving. Um, Also, a lot of bereavement policies in workplaces aren't very conducive. Like maybe, somebody has to show a death certificate,
Mm.
or maybe like if, for example, it could be somebody that's not a blood relative, but it was like a father or a mother to them, but maybe it was a neighbor, but a neighbor doesn't qualify for bereavement leave at somebody's workplace. Like I think, that can be very painful. Or, I just had dear friends who lost a dog. Their dog died of an illness, a sudden illness. Most employers don't give bereavement leave for, a pet loss. But for many
Mm.
people, their pets are their children. And
Right.
Um, you know, I've had over the years, a couple years ago in my grief class, one of my graduate students was like, Dr. Kocet, I don't understand why you're giving a lecture on pet loss.
Mm.
And all the pet people in the room like just gave the student like a glares and looks and like, how dare you,
Yeah.
and another student spoke up and she said like, I'm grieving more for my dog than I did when my dad died because my dog gave me unconditional love, for years.
Mm.
So again, it's about no judgment free zone, like just accept people where they're at and not compare our losses with anybody else's.
Judgment free zone. I like that. That's good. I saw a chart one time where it was sort of about helping people cope with whatever they might be going through in their life. And I'm trying to remember what it was. It was like uh it was like support in, dump out. Does this ring a bell with you at all? That
Um,
so the person who's grieving, say, is at the center of the circle. And as someone out as part of their circle of friends or circle of support, you're supposed to support them and support everyone else inside closer within the circle than you. So maybe they're at the center of the circle and say their spouse is further into the circle than you. And you're a friend, so you're a little outside of that. So you should support the spouse and support the grieving person. And if you have to vent about it, you need to dump toward the outside of the circle. So dump toward another friend who, say, knows them but isn't as close to them as you are, or dump to your own spouse who doesn't maybe have as close a connection with them. Have you ever heard of this before?
I
Or is this some
haven't, but
pop
it makes sense.
psychology thing I picked up somewhere along the way?
I mean, I think in some cases, yeah, like if we're having a grieving friend and in some cases, maybe somebody who's grieving, maybe they would welcome a distraction. So if their friend is having a problem and they talk with them about a problem, it doesn't mean that we can't go to grieving friends or family and talk about other things. But um, the key thing is somebody who's grieving a loss, and it can be even 2, 3, 5 years, 10 years later. People want to have their love, like especially in the cases of a death, they want their loved ones remembered. So for example, even though, and I talk about this a lot, there's no hierarchy of death. However, one of the most painful losses I think that people can experience is the death of a child,
Hmm.
parents or grandparents. And even in my own family, a couple years ago, we had on both sides of my family, we had the losses of a teenager to car accidents, and very tragic. Um, but I would say oftentimes people don't handle grief well, like especially friends, neighbors. So they may avoid that grieving person, especially like a grieving parent, because they may think that it's contagious. Like, oh my gosh, if I hang around that person, then I'll lose a child too, or I don't want to feel that intense pain, or I can't, and
Yeah.
so for example, people will often say to a grieving parent, "Oh, I can't imagine the pain." But we can, and then that's why we want to avoid it.
Yeah.
And so we may not, people who are, parents who are grieving, maybe feeling a little isolated because maybe initially upon the death of their child, people will reach out and offer comfort. But then as the years go by, those parents are still grieving, but people have moved on and they don't ask about the child or share memories. So, like, one of the best things we can do with any grieving person is share memories about the person who died or the pet who died or whatever, even funny stories or, or serious things, because grieving people desperately want their loved ones remembered
Yeah.
and talked about, and not forgotten. So yeah.
That's one thing I've found helpful in connecting with people who are grieving is sharing stories with them about something nice that person did for me at some time or something that gets them talking, gets them, kind of relaxing a little bit, and then they're sharing stories and you're sharing stories, and it's something you can talk about that isn't talking about the grief itself.
Correct. Although sometimes it is okay to talk about the grief, certainly, but yes, sharing funny stories or memories and maybe things that the loved one didn't know about the person who died, like, oh, I didn't know my son, did that, or you had that funny interaction at your house or whatever, so
Yeah.
they're special stories to hear.
It's
And
nice
sometimes
when someone says to me, "Oh, thank you for sharing that with me. I didn't know that." That's
absolutely
always very
it can be a
meaningful.
gift, to hear that, because sometimes people, friends, family are like, well, I don't want to upset the person or I don't want to stir up sad feelings, so I'm not going to mention it. But it actually is the opposite. It can be hurtful when people just don't bring the person up or ignore them or act like they're no longer important, so.
Yeah, that kind of brings me, that's a good transition to my next question, which is how do you help someone cope with the anger that sometimes accompanies grief?
I mean, it can be hard for family members and friends and loved ones to witness the grief and anger that a person, like, again, like say in the case of a death of a child, again, all loss is painful, whether we lose a parent in their 80s or 90s, sometimes people have this perception, oh, well, it's not as much of a loss because they were older, they lived a full life, but that's just so not true. But it's like in the case of a child, especially in case of an accident or cancer, like there is a sense of injustice when a 4-year-old girl dies of cancer, and it's like, she was robbed of her life and things like that. So there understandably is a lot of anger about that. And I think it is important to allow parents or grandparents or other people around to express that anger. But it can be heavy to witness that. But people need to be given permission. Because for example, I've talked to grieving parents who, like, especially in the immediacy of a loss, people are well intentioned, but they'll say things like, well, your daughter's in a better place. She's in heaven with Jesus or whatever, and people are like, I don't want my daughter in heaven. I want my daughter here back. So saying those kind of religious platitudes are not helpful. Even if the grieving person is religious, sometimes losing a child or experiencing that kind of loss may make somebody question their faith. And that's okay. Like as a counselor, like I try to give people permission, like you're allowed to be angry at God. It's okay.
Mm.
Or whatever their higher power or higher being is, it's okay to express that. Because sometimes family members will say, oh, that's a sin. You can't be mad at God or Jesus or whatever. Like, that's very bad. No, in my view, from a mental health perspective, no, it's okay because people need to express that anger and frustration. So I think, just allowing a loved one to express that anger and maybe sharing that anger, like, I'm so angry too, like, this drunk driver hit their loved one, or, a tragic accident, or maybe they're even angry at their loved one because maybe their loved one died by suicide.
Mm.
And there's a lot of unanswered questions, like, why didn't they ask for help? Or I didn't know that they were struggling, or, like, so for example, I've had people in my own life who've died by suicide, and other people will say, oh, well, they were selfish by taking their own life. And I said, no, actually the opposite. When somebody is in a mental health distress enough where they end up taking their own life, they're not in a clear state of being where we can think logically and think things through. They're not in a similar state. So, um, oftentimes an individual truly believes in that moment when they take their life that they are maybe a burden, and they're relieving others of them being a burden, even though no one would think that, family or friends, no one would think that they're a burden. But for whatever reason, again, because of the mental health struggle,
Mhm.
a person may make that decision. And like, so for example, I heard this said that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And so, tragically, often in a case of, like, say, a suicide, if that person would have hung on, one more day or maybe a couple more days, maybe that depression or anxiety or whatever they were experiencing would have passed enough for them to get help or support. But they did not have the capacity to reach out for that help. So like losses like suicide and other things are carry a stigma sometimes.
Mm.
There could be a lot of blame. Family members can blame one another, or a person can be angry at themselves or angry at the person who took their own life. So again, I think it's about normalizing that anger and just allowing that person to express that anger, because maybe they feel guilty. Like, how can I be angry at my child? They were suffering or they were being bullied or and they took their own life. Um, but anger, the whole range of feelings, anger, guilt, like, maybe I should have done something more. I should have seen something. I should have noticed something. But we don't always know. And so I also work with grieving clients about forgiveness,
Mm.
not only forgiving the person who died, but forgiving themselves for, like, we're human. We don't always say the right things or do the right things, but um, forgiveness is key in the sense of grief and loss.
What's in your years now teaching about grief and loss? What's maybe something that you teach that people might not otherwise think of? What are what's maybe a pro tip you can give us?
Well, usually on the first day of class, so I teach typically graduate students who are getting their degree in like mental health counseling or school counseling or social work. And students will say on the first day, Dr. K, like I haven't never experienced grief and loss. My parents are alive, my grandparents are alive. And then after I lecture that first hour and then I do a couple exercises, they're in shock and they're like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize that I was grieving.
Mm.
Because again, it's not death related losses. So I think students take away from my class that not just death, but non-death losses bring about a lot of grief. Like, maybe somebody wanted to be on a sports team or get in a certain college and they didn't do that. And they grieve over that. Or a pregnancy that was terminated, or, miscarriage, that affects people, both mothers and fathers and parents. And so, I've worked with people that decades later, they still think about that child and wonder, how old that child would be today, or, and even under very difficult circumstances where people have to do what's right for them and they make a decision to end a pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy. Um, there's still grief and loss about that, even though they know that they made the best decision at that time. People still think about that loss. So,
Yeah.
so I think it's about giving ourselves and giving other people some grace and understanding and patience, I think is really key. But I don't, I think if we walked around an average day, whether at our place of work or at the grocery store or wherever we are, I think most everybody is carrying some form of grief in their hearts.
Mm.
whether other people know about it or not. So I think it's about just giving people patience and just allowing them just be where they're at.
Yeah, I see that related to just, you know, tips about just being kind generally, is you just never know what someone may be going through.
Right. And I would add to that, you never know when someone is experiencing grief and they're carrying it in their heart. And um, there can be a lot of different triggers. For me, for example, my mom, again, who died about a year ago, she loved wintergreen lifesavers. And so sometimes I'll be in a store and I'll see a wintergreen lifesavers and I just get sad for a moment because I'm like, I'm never gonna buy her any more lifesavers again. So it could be the little things,
Mm.
or again, somebody who has experienced the death of a pet and they see other cats or dogs or animals, um, or they see them with their owners and makes them sad, like, oh, we're never gonna hug our dog again or our cat or whatever. Um, again, it's just, those little I call them grief spurts
Mm.
where we might be living our day and again, not even thinking about the person who died or whatever. And then all of a sudden a song comes on the radio or we see something or maybe somehow we smell their perfume or cologne. And all of a sudden, like we have a grief spurt, like maybe it lasts 5 minutes, maybe it lasts all day. It depends,
Yeah.
you know.
One last question for you. Um, what are a few things maybe we should be careful not to say? I know we've touched on this a little bit just throughout the interview, but what would you say, if somebody's just trying to be sensitive to someone, what would you advise them to be careful not to say?
I wouldn't minimize the loss, or again, I wouldn't give any kind of platitude or, like they're in a better place, or again, there's other fish in the sea, you'll meet somebody else. Like that's never helpful. It's no one is going to be like, oh my gosh, you're right. Like there are other people out there that I can date. Like, they're not going to be like, oh, thank you so much. That's so helpful and kind.
Right.
So I would just say sometimes the best thing to say is like, there's no magic words for me to say that can help your pain, but I just want you to know I'm here for you.
Mm.
And sometimes again, the best thing that we can do for somebody is, not even waiting to be asked, but again, cut the neighbor's grass. If a neighbor is going through grief and they just don't have the energy to cut the grass, go mow their lawn or, leave them a basket of groceries on their doorstep or, take their dog for a walk, again, whatever, run their kids to their soccer practice, whatever, those
Mm.
tangible things. And that doesn't even involve like having to discuss the loss, but just having some of those things take care of can be a huge relief to a grieving person.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been really insightful.
Well, I appreciate the invitation, Matt, and glad that your podcast is getting out there and hope this was helpful to your listeners.
This brings us to the end of this episode of It Matters How We Treat One Another. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Michael Kocet, for helping us shed more light on the not often talked about topic of helping friends and loved ones navigate loss and grief. And now for the takeaway. Here are your takeaways from this episode. A good place to start when it comes to supporting others through loss and grief is to simply be present for them. There are two forms of grief. Someone might be grieving a loss, or they might be grieving things that they never had but wished they did. Disenfranchised losses are the kinds of losses they don't make Hallmark cards for. These can be things like the death of an ex or falling short of a goal. These events might still cause grief, and it can be helpful for us to lend our support. Every relationship is different, and no two people grieve the same way. So we shouldn't assume that because we have experienced loss, that we have any idea what someone else might be going through. Two good questions to ask a grieving person are: one, what do you need right now? And two, what don't you need right now? Something we can do for others is create a judgment-free zone where we simply accept what they are going through and don't try to critique their feelings or compare them to ourselves and our experiences. If you want to learn more about the system I brought up with circles of support, the concept is called ring theory. You can search for it online by that name. And the helpful catchphrase I was trying to find in my head at the time is comfort in, dump out. Comfort in, dump out. The key thing is to continue to make an effort to connect meaningfully with people who are grieving and share stories with them about the person they lost. Happy memories of a lost loved one can be a gift. We can help prevent suicide by encouraging others to hold on for another day or another few days. Often, the factors that are making a person feel suicidal will ease with time. Pro tip: we can help others identify times when they might be grieving a non-death related loss, like not getting a promotion they want or not getting into the college of their choice. They might be grieving and not even realize it. We can help them to identify and cope with this kind of loss. And finally, overall, try to give people grace, understanding, and patience. Please subscribe to keep up with all of our episodes, and you can support the show by shopping our Etsy store at etsy.com/shop/itmattersmerch. There's a link in the description. Your quote for the week is: "The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to." That is from authors Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler from their book On Grief and Grieving. And remember, treat everyone with kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion, and try for acceptance and love whenever possible. Be well, and much love to you all. Thanks.